Hey, my friends, it's Rich Lewis. I hope you're doing well today. So, today is the latest installment in my Did You Know teaching series, and we're on video number 13, I believe, and we are covering one of Jesus' most controversial and powerful parables that he ever taught. It's called the story of Lazarus and the Rich Man. I'm excited about this. I've been packing all my data, my information together, so hopefully I can keep this not too incredibly long. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. Did you know that the story of Lazarus and the rich man was actually based off of another story that scholars think was over 1,000 years old? I did not know that. That was news to me when I started this journey 10 years ago. I was like, wow, that's really powerful. And another thing, too, I learned within that is that this story wasn't so much, the purpose wasn't so much to give us a peek behind the supernatural curtain to see what it looks like after a person dies, but rather the main purpose of it, it was a morality tale. It was a story meant to teach you how to get along better with your fellow brothers and sisters here on earth. It's like, whoa, that was really cool. Okay, so where am I getting all this from? Let's start with the story. Now, before we pull it up in your Bible or your Bible app, let's do our little exercise that we did on the previous video with the talking about the parable of the sheep and the baby goats. Okay, that's a really good one, by the way. But one of the little exercises we did was let's take our cultural lens off. Okay, our glasses. Let's set it on the table. Our way of looking at things. Let's set that down and let's try and put on the cultural lens of the audience of that day. Like, what would this story? What would it have meant to them? Okay. If we can understand what it meant to them, then it helps us to better understand how we apply it to ourselves. So, if you have your Bible app or your Bible, go to the middle, turn right, not left, go to the New Testament. You're going to go to the book of Luke, chapter 16, and it starts in verse 19. Now, let me see if I can just give you the Rich Lewis paraphrase of this without reading it word for word, because you can do that on your own. So, basically, the way the story goes, Jesus is telling his audience about there once was this rich man, and this guy he was super wealthy. Okay, he wore the best clothes every single day. He had these massive banquets. He ate to the fullest every single day, which that was a no-no back then because you're supposed to at least take one day off called the Sabbath or the Shabbat in Hebrew, and he didn't do that. Ooh, he's already turned out to be a villain in this story. They're like, wait a minute, you're not supposed to do that. Well, then you have, in contrast, you have this poor man named Lazarus. Now, time out for a second. This is the only time that we're aware of that Jesus ever named one of his characters in the story. Actually, he named two of them in this story, but that's the first ever. It's like, whoa, why would he use a real name right here? Because before, all the characters had, anonymous kind of things like the rich man. We don't know what his real name was, but here's Lazarus. Okay, so the poor man is Lazarus, and Lazarus is a complete contrast to the rich man, completely different. He had no food. He was hungry all the time. He was longing for the scraps coming from the rich guy's table. He had sickness. He had sores all over him, and even the dogs would come and lick his sores. Okay, so I mean, Lazarus had just the worst of conditions. The rich man had the best of conditions. Well, the way the story goes, the poor man dies, and he's carried off by the angels to a place called Abraham's bosom. Okay, so that's in the place of the dead. Sheol did a video on that. Greek version is Hades. Did a video on that too. That's the in that particular mindset, that's the good side of the place of the dead. Okay, so he's taken to Abraham's bosom. And then the rich man, he also died, and the rich man, he was buried. They had a funeral for him, and because I don't think they had a funeral for Lazarus. Jesus left that detail out, by the way. And the rich man, after his funeral, he died. He's dead, and he wakes up in Hades. Okay, not hell, but Hades, Greek word Hades, place of the dead. Okay, we did a video on that. He wakes up in Hades, and he's in this torment. I did another video on that, the video Basanos, where I was scraping the coin against the rock, the touchstone. He wakes up in torment. And he sees from afar, he sees Abraham and Lazarus. Now, who's Abraham? Well, Abraham, the character in this story, that's referencing Father Abraham. Okay, the beginning of the Jewish race of people. Okay, so this is Abraham from the book of Genesis. And so the rich man, as he sees him, he calls out to him, and he calls out to Abraham. He invokes the title of Father Abraham. In other words, I'm a child of Abraham, okay? Father Abraham, I need you to tell Lazarus to do something for me. I need you to tell Lazarus to dip his finger in water so it will cool my tongue because I'm in agony in these flames. Oh my gosh, he is trying to boss people around. Wow, he hadn't learned anything yet. So he's trying to get Abraham to do his bidding, to get Lazarus to do his bidding. I mean, no, that's not going to work. And Abraham responds. He's like, "No, my son." He calls him my son. A kind phrase. "No, my son. You had the best in life." and Lazarus had the worst. And besides, there's this chasm, this gulf, okay, this separation between us and you. And so those of us over here that would want to come over to your side, we can't do that. And those of y'all on your side that would want to come over to our side, you can't do that either. Well, then that's not good enough for the rich man, okay, because he's not used to being told no. Okay, he still hadn't learned anything yet. So the rich man, he says, he says no. He says, look, I need you to tell Lazarus to go tell my brothers. I have 5 brothers back on earth. I need you to tell them, you to tell him to tell them how to avoid this place, because I don't want them coming here. Now, on the surface, that might look like a bit of a kindness, and to an extent, it might have been a bit of kindness, but more than anything, once again, he's trying to boss people around, and he thought of himself as an elite. Okay, so his brothers would have been the elite, the upper crust. And he's like, no, I want you to send Lazarus over there to tell them how they can avoid this, because I don't want them to, to go to this bad place I'm at. Abraham says, no, I'm not going to do it. They have the teachings of Moses and the prophets. In other words, if they listen to that, they'll avoid the place that you're in. And he comes back on him again. The rich man says, no, you see, they'll listen. If you send Lazarus, you're sending a dead man, a man from the dead, back to life. They'll listen to him. And Abraham's like, no, they're not going to listen to him, okay? If they won't listen to the teachings of Moses and the prophets, not even someone rising from the dead will convince them otherwise. And then the story ends like that. We don't know what happens next. Well, that's the way ancient stories work. They often left you on a cliffhanger. They're just like, whoa, what happens next? Well, they're going to let you fill in the blanks, because, see, you're the listener. You got to decide, who are you in the story? Which one of these characters represents who you are with where you're at in life right now? So the listener is supposed to fill in the blanks on this story. Oh my word! Okay, so this is so jam packed with so many things. So first of all, let's look at the lenses that we can look at this through. There's essentially 2 camps. Two sets of lenses that we could view this story through. Okay, is it literal or is it a symbolic story? Okay, now I'm going to fall into both camps. Okay, I think there's elements that each side they do make sense. Okay, so but if you lean too far to either side, you're going to miss the point of it. So if you go all the way to the literal side, you're going to see this as literally there was a rich man, and literally there was a guy named Lazarus, and there was literally this scene happening on the other side where Abraham's on this one side, and there's flames over here, and there's this huge chasm and gold. If you take the story completely literal, you're going to miss the principles within it, because it wasn't necessarily meant to give a peek behind the curtain. Okay, to say, oh, this is exactly how it looks like, and we know that because of where we're going to get with, like, this is based off of some stories that had already happened before. So this was not a completely original story. This was Jesus' original take on stories that they would have already been familiar with. Okay, so we can't take it completely literal, because this isn't just a story out of the blue. Okay, but at the same time, you can't lean to the other side too far with this idea that it's completely symbolic and metaphorical. Okay, where, in other words, we would call those allegories. Okay, that's a fancy word for saying it's a story that it didn't really happen at all, and it's like every single thing in there is just pure symbolism. Okay, every character means this, and every setting and scene means that. Well, if you made me lean one towards the other, I'd probably lean more towards the allegory side. But once again, it's not a pure allegory. So you have to keep your foot in both camps. Okay, there's truth in both of these perspectives here. So when we blend it together, it really helps us better understand what's going on. Well, what did the literal side get right? Well, actually, it's the names right here: Abraham and Lazarus. So Lazarus is a Greek way of saying the Hebrew name Eleazar. Okay, and in fact, the name Eleazar in Hebrew, it literally means the one whom God helps. All right, now these character names, why did Jesus do this? Man, it was so strategic. So these are, I believe these are real people that he's referring to, because the coincidence, it's just too coincidental to be accidental. So if you go to the book of Genesis, okay, go to the middle of your Bible and turn left, you go to the first book of the Bible in Genesis, you look in chapters 15 and chapters 24, you're going to get some history on this actual Abraham character, okay, the real Abraham that lived and he started the Jewish race, but also his second-hand man was Eleazar, Lazarus. Wow, that's kind of powerful. That can't be coincidence, in my opinion. Eleazar was his chief servant. He was the man in charge of running the entire estate for Abraham, okay? So, and also, if Abraham had not had a male heir, Eleazar would have inherited everything because of the way the customs were set up back then. So, wow, I think Jesus invoked these real names so that he could add some extra punch to the characters in there. It's like, hey, wait, we know through the oral traditions here, we know who Abraham is and Eleazar. We're familiar with those stories, okay? So, I think you've got some real names of real people connected to these fictional characters in the story, and it's bringing real power to it. So further, let's go further. Let's see. Go to my next note right here. Oh, so here's how we know that this is a story. Jesus' story here is based off of some other stories. So one of the main resources you can go to is this thing called the Gemara Babylonicum. Okay, also known as the Jewish Talmud or Talmud, Talmud, if you want to sound it out like that. So the Talmud actually gives us some history of several different stories that were being shared during the first century of Jewish life. Okay, so a couple of these stories. One was a story about a king and a poor man, and basically it set up like this king had this huge banquet, and this poor man, came over there, and he's trying to get into the banquet, but the king won't let him, and the poor man's pleading to him, like, "Hey, would you please let me have some of your food here?" And he essentially doesn't. Okay, so that would have been one of those stories going around. Another one that was probably more not powerful, more popular than the king and the poor man. In fact, you know what? Let me go ahead and pull up my lovely little whiteboard right here. I wrote these out. Almost forgot about that. I wrote these out so you could see it. Okay, so at the top you have Jesus' original story. Okay, Lazarus and the Rich Man. Let me see if I can get this just right where I'm not blinding you. There we go. Okay, you have the story of Lazarus and the Rich Man. Jesus' original, based off of some others before that. You have the king and the poor man. Then you have the rabbi and the tax collector. Both of those are first century stories, but they're based off of an Egyptian story that scholars believe would have happened somewhere around 1250 BC, and that was a story about an Egyptian who fought against this Ethiopian magician. Okay, so we got that right there. I just want to make sure I get it in so you can pause that and look at it. All right, so back to the story about the rabbi and the tax collector. So there was a story going around. I mean, if you're a couple of guys standing in the audience and you're listening to Jesus tell this story, you're like, "Hey, wait a minute, I've heard this story before. This sounds familiar." Yeah, man, this sounds a lot like the rabbi and the tax collector. Yeah, and kind of like the king and the poor man. So the rabbi and the tax collector, the way the story goes, there was this rabbi, a very godly man in the village that he lived in, and then there was also this tax collector who was not a very godly man, but he was very shrewd. And especially very political in the way he would handle, connect with people. Well, they both died, and the rabbi died, and basically no one came to his funeral. The tax collector died, and they shut the entire village down for people to attend his funeral. Well, then the next scene of the story, you have both of them in this beautiful place, this beautiful garden with streams and rivers and all this, and you see that the rabbi, he's able to enjoy these deep wells of water. He's drinking, he's fulfilled all that, and you've got the tax collector over here by the streams of water, and he's trying to drink the water, and he can't drink it. He's completely unsatisfied, even though there's all this beauty around him. So that would have been one of those main stories that they would have known back then. But then, if you go even further into it, back to the Egyptian tale. So the way the Egyptian tale goes, there was this man. There's this man who was in the underworld, and he was allowed to come back to life. He was allowed to be reborn as this child named Osiris. Okay, and he was called back to life because there was this Ethiopian magician that none of the Egyptian magicians could defeat. He was very powerful, and they had to find a way to defeat him. So they resurrected this man, and when this man Osiris, when he became about 12 years old, he was able to battle against the magician and defeat him. Okay, and so before returning to the underworld, him and his father, they witnessed these two funerals that are happening, one of a rich man and one of a poor man. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Okay. And his father makes this observation. He says, "Well, I hope when I die, I'd rather have a funeral like the rich man than the poor man, because the rich man, everybody's grieving over, and the poor man, no one even really noticed, hardly even noticed he was there." Well, his son, being from the underworld, he's already seen what happens over there. He takes him somehow on a tour of the underworld. He wants to show him what's happening, where essentially the rich man, he's going through these terrible punishments, and the poor man is actually being rewarded for different things in his life. That was the basis of the story that Jesus was telling here. Everyone would have been aware of these stories within their mindset. So, what's the point of it all? Okay, another thing too, before we get into the moral of the story, okay, the literary style that Jesus was using here, very well-known literary style. It was called Aggadah, okay, or Aggadic literature, all right, Aggadic. Okay, that type of literature, agadic literature, it was a common tool that was used by the rabbis back then, and this is where they would teach moral principles. A moral, that's simply another way of saying this is a principle for how you can live life, knowing right versus wrong, and how you live it out with your fellow brothers and sisters. Okay, they would teach these principles through these types of stories to their pupils because they wanted them to be able to oh, that's how you apply the principle here. Back to, like I said before, concrete matching abstract right here. It was beautiful. It's really no different from, you may have heard of things like Aesop's fables, the Greek storyteller. And he would tell all these different fables that would involve, inanimate objects like plants and even animals, that kind of thing. In fact, one of the most famous Aesop's fable is the story of the tortoise and the hare. The race between the turtle and the rabbit. Well, the point of that story, if you take that story literal, I mean, we know not to take it literal because it's not literally trying to show you how to set up a race between a turtle and a rabbit. No, what it is, it's meant to teach a deeper principle within there. In other words, we all know what the moral of the principle of the story is. It's slow and steady wins the race, and don't get too cocky with your abilities because it may come back to bite you, and your pride's going to come before your fall. I mean, that's essentially what we're learning from that story. Same thing with this style of storytelling that Jesus is employing that he would have been very familiar with, and the people would have been very familiar with it. So what are some of the deeper meanings within the story? Okay, so what's the symbolism? Who does the rich man represent? Well, first of all, what's the main point of the story? This is a massive rebuke against the leadership, okay? Jesus is thumping them between the eyeballs right now. It is fantastic. And the listeners, they're loving this. They're like, yep, I know who you're talking about, Jesus. It's the rich man. He represents the Jewish leadership, okay? And it was all of them, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. In fact, this whole thing of including the supernatural part of it and the possibility of someone coming back from the dead, that was a thump to the Sadducees right there, because they didn't believe in resurrection. But at the same time, people the rich man walking around the finest clothes and everything, that was a thump on the Pharisees and the scribes, particularly the Pharisees, because, this purple linen, it was so expensive. More than likely, it was the kind that the dye was actually, that they got for the clothing actually came from mollusks, and you'd have to fish out a whole lot of different mollusks on the seashore just to be able to, one drop of dye would come out of one mollusk. It was incredibly expensive stuff. Jesus had a very awesome sense of humor right here, too. He was talking about the undergarment. That would have been the outer linen with the purple, but he said fine linen. That was a Greek and Hebrew way of saying the undergarments. Basically, he's talking about their underwear, and he said they wore the finest of underwear. In other words, this word that was used, the type of fine linen. The scholars believe that 1 ounce of this linen, you had to buy it with 1 ounce of gold. So this is Jesus' way of saying yeah, they were so rich and they squandered everything. They were wearing golden underwear essentially. It's just fantastic when you can understand what the people would have been hearing at that time. So here he is. It's a rebuke against the leadership, because it's hey, you're having all these banquets, you're doing all these massive feasts, and your fellow brothers out there starving. Well, who does Lazarus, the poor man, represent? The people. The common folk. They're completely dependent upon not just their economy there, but their spiritual economy too. The leaders are not feeding them spiritually, and they're not even feeding them scraps off the table. It is just a massive rebuke of the leadership and their failure to lead by example. So the poor man represents the common folk. Well, the character of the dogs, do they represent anything? I think this is a really cool point right here. So these type of dogs, these would not have been pets, okay? They didn't see dogs like that. If you're a rich man and you have dogs, these are guard dogs, okay? They're guarding your property, keeping the transients out, okay? All the poor people. Well, the story goes, these dogs, they're actually licking the sores of Lazarus. That wasn't a bad thing, okay? Even to this day, and all throughout the past several thousand years, you have people that own dogs that actually will rent their dogs out to lick people's sores. It might sound gross, but see, science has taught us that there's actually a chemical in dog saliva. I believe these are peptide antibiotics, and this chemical actually has healing properties within it. And so when a dog is licking someone's sore, that's actually a healing component right there. Okay, so if you take it as literal dogs on the story, oh my gosh, they're actually ministering to Lazarus. But on a symbolic level, the dogs, more than likely, Jesus was probably referring to the Gentiles, because that was a very Jewish way of referring to Gentiles. They called them dogs, okay? They saw dogs as basically worthless. Well, that's the way they saw the Gentiles. And here's Jesus saying, hey, you know what? You're not taking care of your own people right here, Jewish leaders. The dogs, the Gentiles, they do a better job of taking care of people like Lazarus. Oh my gosh, no wonder they were so mad at Jesus. They're like, this guy is messing with us. And you know what? People are starting to listen. These stories are starting to resonate with the people. So, what's our ultimate conclusion here to the story? What is the ultimate moral that Jesus is trying to teach us? Stewardship. The rich man did a horrible job of being a steward. What's a steward? Someone that doesn't own anything. You're a steward. I'm a steward. We don't own anything, guys. Everything that we have is a gift of God. Rich, I work hard. Okay, I work hard for the money. I've got physical strength, or I've got mental strength. I work hard. Yeah, I'm glad you do. Okay, but even that strength that you have and those abilities you have, they're still gifts. And any possession that you have, it's a gift. This is Jesus' way of saying, what kind of steward are you going to be? The rich man had everything he could possibly desire, and he used it all simply to enhance himself. He didn't use it to help others out. He was greedy. He was selfish. He was essentially ungrateful for everything he had. The contrast to that, look at Lazarus. He had basically nothing, guys. He didn't have his own home. He didn't have food. He didn't have health. He didn't have any of that. But yet, look at his attitude. He was a gentle soul. He was kind. He was at peace even with the dogs, okay? These are vicious animals in the story, but he was at peace with all of that. He managed what he had been given, even though it was just, like nothing compared to what the rich man was given. Stewardship. The moral of the story, the question that you have to ask yourself at the end of the story, what kind of steward are you going to be? Are you going to be like the rich man and you lose everything like that? Or are you going to be like Lazarus? So essentially, be a better steward of what you've been given and love your neighbor as yourself. I think that's the ultimate teaching of the story. I hope that blesses you today. If you have any questions, let me know. Oh my goodness, this is one of the longest videos I've ever done in my life. And until the last heart is won, I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.